Well, just to start off with this, there's a lot of stuff that we haven't learned from going into decades of endless wars. Now, the one thing we got to do is learn how to stop this. Um, Now, 2 decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan had little effect on daily life in America, and that tells us way too much, basically. Um, when I when we urge writing students to juice up their stories, we tell them about disruptive technologies, inventions, and concepts that end up irrevocably changing the industries. Now think, look at iPhones, personal computers, or to reach deeper into history, steamships. It's the tech version of what we used to call a paradigm shift. Um, Now President Biden likes to refer to it as an inflection point. Now, certain events will function that way too, but after they occur, it's impossible to go back to how things were. Now, World War II for one generation, the Vietnam War for another, and 9/11 for a third. Um, so we have World War II, the Vietnam War, and 9/11. It tells me that it isn't hard now to remember what it was like to catch a flight without schlepping down roped up chutes at cattle to the slaughter, even if even if most of the history of air travel, no one worried about the underwear bombers or explosive baby formula. Of course, once upon a time, we weren't incessantly at war either. Now, um, the students they're clumsily named Gen Z. That transformative event in their lives hasn't really been a war at all for them, no matter what their country had been enmeshed in one way or the other. And also for their conscious lives, it's probably George Floyd's murder, or the COVID pandemic, or the double whammy of both, mixed in with the deadly brew of Trumpism that alone strikes me as a paradigm shift. It's not that they're uncaring, but those I know are ardent about fixing the myriad wrongs in the world, and they're prepared to work at it too. And like many Americans, for a few weeks as August of 2021 ended, they were alarmed by the heartbreaking consequences of their country's failed mission in Afghanistan and its portrayal of the people there. Now, how could you not be heartbroken about people desperate to save their own lives and livelihood? And the girls, yes, all the girls, the 37% of the teenage girls who learned to read in those years, went to school with those boys, saw their lives change, and probably will be denied all of that in the years to come. Now, in my more cynical moments, though, we note that we note that it was the girls and women who were regularly trotted out by our government officials and generals, insisting that U.S. troops must remain in Afghanistan until what? Until, as it turned out, disaster struck. Now, after all, what good-hearted American doesn't warm to educating the young and freeing girls from forced marriages, as opposed, of course, to killing civilians and causing fucking chaos? Now, militarism is among the all-American problems that the young activists face. Basically, sometimes, and we also sometimes bring it up, it's just not very high on their list of issues that we're facing. The reasons boil down to this. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, interminable as they are, had little to no effect on most of the students or lives that they imagined having, and that was reflected in the relative lack of attention to them, which tells us all too much about what the country is going through in the 21st century. So now here we are 20 years later after 9/11 happened. After the US troops invaded Afghanistan and months since they hot-footed it out. That 2 decade long boots on the ground and planes in the air episode has now officially been declared over and done with, but not exactly paid for. But what was that inflection point, as Joe Biden called it, or as this country turned its military attention to China and Russia, but not so fucking fast. We're impatient with the conventional wisdom about our 21st century wars and the reaction to them at home. Still, do we think it's important to try to figure out what has or hasn't been learned from them and what may have changed because of them? In the change column, alas, the answer seems to be not enough. And once again, in the pandemic moment, a military is filling roles that would be left to civil society if it were adequately funded the right way. Now, helping in hospitals and nursing homes, administering COVID-19 vaccination tests, teaching school and driving school buses because, as Willie Sutton answered when asked why he robbed banks, because that's where the fucking money is. Apparently, it's so much money that even the Defense Department doesn't quite know how to spend the shit. Between 2008 and 2019, the Pentagon returned almost $128 billion in unspent funds from its staggeringly vast and still expanding budget. Now, admittedly, that's a smaller percentage of that budget than other departments turned back. but it started with so much more, and as a result, that Pentagon spare change accounted for nearly half of the all canceled government funds during that time. And yet too little of those vast sums had been spent to go to active duty troops. Now, a recent survey found that 29% of the families of junior level active duty soldiers had experienced food insecurity, meaning hunger, in the past year alone, a strong indicator of the economic precariousness of everyday military life, even here at home. And it didn't help that the U.S. military's wars were only sporadically drew what we call extended public attention. Now, of course, before 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, that country's name was shorthand for a place too obscure for most Americans even to find on a world map. And maybe that was still true in 2020, but when nearly 2 decades after the U.S. invaded that nation, um, the, the American presence there got all of 5 minutes of a coverage on the national even newscast of CBS, NBC, and ABC. Now, years earlier, when the focus was more on Iraq than Afghanistan, basically, there was a meeting that was met with at the Smedley Butler Brigade of Veterans for Peace. Basically, there was a person writing a story for the Boston Globe, which made that person an easy target for the veterans' anger. Now, as a result, they badgered the writer to make the city's newspaper of record print a daily report of deaths in the war, and we explained that as a freelancer I had even less influence than they did, and unsurprisingly, such an accounting never came to pass. Now, years later, as the U.S. endeavor in Afghanistan wound down and the Globe and other mainstream outlets did actually publish calculations of the cost, we found basically ourselves wondering if all those credible, influential media sources would ever publish a reckoning of how many times in the past 20 years, when it might have made a fucking difference if they had run cost analysis of the blinding arrogance that defined U.S. foreign and military policy in those decades, and the impact of such accountings might have been vanishingly small anyway. It's true, by the way, that Brown University's Cost of War project did a formidable job of tackling that issue in those endless war years, but even by their accounts, they were of course anything but mainstream. Now, even today in the mainstream media, accurate accounts are still hard to come by. The New York Times, which recently published a groundbreaking report on civilian deaths in the Middle East that was caused by U.S. airstrikes, was stymied by the Pentagon for years when trying to get the necessary documents for just such an accounting for that. And while provincial authorities in Afghanistan often denied the civilian casualties that even occurred. Now, in 2004, when Iraq Veterans Against the War, also known as IVAW, was just getting started, basically, people were introduced to a small group of disillusioned but determined young vets, and wonderfully full of themselves and intent on doing things their own way. And while they appreciated the earlier soldier-led anti-war efforts of the Vietnam War era, they wanted to do it in a new fashion. We're sort of reinventing what we call the wheel, Eli Wright, a young medic who had served in Iraq, said. But we're making it a much nicer wheel, I think, and people were smitten. Now, at first, those newly minted what we call anti-warriors thought that the very novelty of their existence in War on Terror America would be just enough. So they told and retold their stories to anyone who would listen, stories of misguided rage and policing actions for which they were ill-equipped and ill-trained for, of soul-destroying cruelty that they found themselves implicated in, and of the dawning awareness, even while they were in Iraq, that they could no longer be a party to any of this. And believe me, those veterans told powerful and moving stories, but it was not enough. Now, in a piece about the power and pitfalls of storytelling, Jonathan Gottschall notes that, in the tales as we tell, we tend to divide people into a tidy triad of heroes, victims, or villains. Now, the long-time trope was that we, but by which I mean Americans, allowed those fighting our endless wars to be our only heroes or victims, and the former is to valorize, the latter to pity, but nothing else. Admittedly, sometimes civilian peace workers did see themselves as villains, but despite an inevitable jockeying for position, civilian or military, the anti-war groups generally recognized each other as comrades against arms. Now, IVAW insisted on adding an activist to that dichotomy as they attempted to change minds in history. Now, when you're trying to do this, or at least influence policy, your odds of success are greater if you have a clear, specific goal that you can advocate for, and agitate for, and build coalitions around. Now, then, when you achieve it, you can of course claim victory. Now, IVAW's overriding aim was to bring the troops home immediately, but that goal was finally more or less achieved, though at a greater cost and so much later than they had been demanding, making it anything but a resounding victory, nor did it, in the end, have much to do with those young veterans. Now, their significance may lie elsewhere. Last August, in the midst of the chaotic U.S. pullout from Afghanistan, basically somebody had turned into a podcast about political and social activism, just as Rashad Robinson, who was president of the racial justice organization Color of Change, was making a distinction between presence, like retweets, shoutouts from the stage, and power and the ability to change the rules. And it would be hard to come up with a better illustration of that defense than Camp Casey. The August 2005 encampment of anti-war military families, veterans, and their sympathizers. It was sprawled out across a ditch in Crawford, Texas, a few miles down from the road from the ranch of vacationing President George W. Bush was at. The protest made significant news for those 5 weeks as media around the world featured heart-rending stories of mothers in mourning and veterans in tears, and photos of an iconic white tent and interviews with Cindy Sheehan, whose son Casey had been killed in Iraq the year before. The media anointed her the grieving mother-in-chief, and news reports sometimes even got the protesters ended the war and bringing the troops home message rate. Now, whizzing past on a motorcade on his way to a fundraiser, Bush had ignored them, and the war in Iraq continued for another 5 years with the deaths of about 2,700 more people of grieving American mothers. But the next month, when somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Camp Casey participants, veterans and their supporters gathered for an anti-war march through downtown Washington, the government was forced to acknowledge, and perhaps for the first time, the existence of opposition to the war in Iraq. Now, for context, the National Park Service estimated then that of the approximately 3,000 permits that it issued for demonstrations on the National Mall early, only about a dozen attracted more than 5,000 people. Now, presence matters, and in the few years following Camp Casey, and when the anti-war veterans were at their most effective, they learned how to make themselves harder to ignore. Now, they've since renamed their group They've since renamed their group About Face, and they reconceived its purpose and goals, but the perennial challenge to political activists is how to turn presence into power. In February of 2003, as many as 10 million Americans took to the streets in 60 different places to protest the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But once that invasion happened, it was primarily the military-related groups that were sometimes joined by other peace organizations that kept the opposition alive. Now, why, though? Couldn't they turn presence into power? And why didn't more Americans take up the campaign to end 2 such pointless wars? And why didn't we learn from it? Basically, we make no claim to answering those questions in a definitive way, but nonetheless, here's my fucking stab at it. Now, let's start with the obvious. Repercussions of an all volunteer military. Now, only a small portion of Americans, self-selected and concentrated in certain parts of the country, have been directly involved in and affected by 21st century wars. Deployed over and over again, they didn't circulate in the civil society in the way the previous draft military had, and as warfare became increasingly mechanized and automated or dronified, there have been ever fewer American casualties to remind everyone else in this country that we were indeed at war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, for the troops, that distancing from battle also undoubtedly lessened an innate human resistance to killing, and it also objects to those wars within the military itself. Now, next, stylish as it might be in this country to honor veterans of our wars and we thank them for their service. As Kelly Doherty, IVAW's first executive director, said, "We come home and everyone shakes their hands and calls us heroes, but no one wants to listen to our stories of our bravery, stories of our horrific wounds, and even our stories of post-traumatic stress syndrome were acceptable. But analyze this, incite our testimony about what was actually going on in the war zones, not so fucking much." Now, folk singer and labor organizer and vet Utah Phillips has observed what having a long memory is the most radical idea in America. Now, with items in the news cycle lasting forever the shorter periods of time before being replaced, administrations becoming ever harder to embarrass, and the voting public getting accustomed to being lied to, even a short memory becomes a challenge. Now, the hollowing out of local news in these years only exacerbate the problem. Less local reporting meant fewer stories about people we might actually know or examples of how world events affect our daily lives. Now, the pro-war PR, better funded and connected than any anti-war group could ever hope to be, filled in that gap. Now, think soldiers striding onto ball fields at sporting events to the cheery surprise of families and self-congratulatory cheers from the stands. Between the years of 2012 and 2015, the Pentagon paid pro sports teams about $7 million to regularly and repeatedly honor the military. Now, meanwhile, the mainstream media has made it ever harder for peace groups to gain traction by applying a double standard to protest our outsider politics. A reality socialist, Sarah Silberberg, has explored starkly in her book, Soundbitten. The nature of political protest changed too. As information was disseminated and shared more and more through social media, activism by way of hashtag, tweet, and Instagram organizing turned ever more virtual and ever less communal. Finally, despite the protestations about the United States being a peace-loving country, the military in these years has proven a rare bipartisan darling, while historically speaking, violence has been bred into American bones. Now, maybe, however, the lack of activism, the active opposition to the endless wars, wasn't a new normal for us, but something like the old. Sadly enough, conflicts don't simply end because people march against them. Even the far larger Vietnam anti-war movement was only one pressure point in winding down that conflict, and the war policy is directed by what happens on the ground and to a lesser degree. And at the fucking ballot box, what an anti-war movement can do is help direct the public response, which may, if we keep our fingers crossed, save the country from going to another war someplace else, and save another generation of soldiers from having to repeat the same mistakes that we made the past 20 years. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, and you can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And also, if you want to support my work even further, I have you can donate to my Patreon link on YouTube, which you can find in the About section to help further support the work. And thanks for listening.